So, by now we're almost certainly all regrettably familiar with generative AI, technology that is able to generate responses to human prompts in the form of text, photos, or videos. I'm going to be blunt and say that it is technology that I am not a fan of. It is not good at what it does, and even if it were, its impacts are not worth the costs of it. It is going to be terrible for democracy, society, and safety to have widely available technology that can generate photos, audios, and videos of events that never happened. Whether that means a political leader being made to make a statement they never said, or a prosecutor deciding to generate security camera footage of you shoplifting, like in this video generated by Sora of OpenAI CEO Sam Altman shoplifting GPUs. However, this video is mostly not going to focus on generative AI's capacity for misinformation. It will be part of the video because it's impossible to avoid discussing how technology that is primarily motivated by getting you to continue using it as much as possible will lie to you if that's what you want to hear. But that's not really the focus here. Similarly, we're not going to really focus on the environmental impact of generative AI in terms of pollution, or the colossal demand for electricity it's created, which has driven everyone's utility prices up sharply and strained electrical grids to the breaking point. Instead, I want to focus on how generative AI is going to affect the economy. Specifically, how it's going to obliterate any semblance of a functional one. We're not even talking about the AI bubble, which is all but guaranteed to burst in the next few years, if not, the next few months. We're talking about what happens in a timeline where that either somehow doesn't happen or just takes too long to happen, where the AI bros get their way and where every industry from law to art to finance to software engineering gets overrun with generative AI. And you might argue that if that were truly going to be the impact of the tech, then obviously businesses wouldn't be pushing for it. They need a functioning economy to keep making money after all. And in theory, you're right. However, in practice, generative AI has put virtually every firm in the economy into a collective prisoner's dilemma, a scenario in which cooperation is the most mutually beneficial but carries the greatest risk, whereas betrayal is the option with the greatest individual reward and the far lower risk. The prisoner's dilemma does have a solution, though. There is a way to beat it. Unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to get there in time. Let's get into it. Part 1. The Prisoner's Dilemma. So, the prisoner's dilemma is a part of game theory that puts two parties in a hypothetical scenario in which a crime has been committed, and the two parties have been taken into custody. They are separated and then each presented with two options: confess to the crime or stay silent. They are told that if they agree to betray their partner, confess, and testify against them, then they will get to go free while their partner serves 20 years for the crime, assuming that their partner doesn't also try to rat them out. If that happens, then they'll both get 5 years in prison. If they stay silent and refuse to testify, then both they and their partner will get 1 year in prison. That is, unless their partner chooses to betray them and confess, in which case they'll get 20 years while their partner goes free. The last thing they're told is that their partner has also been presented with the same options and information, and then both parties are asked to make a choice: ally or betray. This is also the core concept of the 2012 3DS game Zero Escape Virtue's Last Reward, where the participants will have to regularly enter into a prisoner's dilemma against one another in the form of the Ambidex game. But we'll get to that later. Anyways, this is the basic prisoner's dilemma. The correct decision to make is to betray your partner. After all, betrayal carries the greatest potential reward and the least potential risk of your two options. Sure, you could both cooperate and only get 1 year, but if you try and cooperate and your partner betrays you, then you're fucked, and they get the huge reward. Mutual betrayal isn't as good as mutual cooperation, but it is far better than getting screwed over. However, while the basic concept of the prisoner's dilemma itself assumes an information vacuum for the most part and no potential to communicate with the opponent, in reality that's not always the case. The decision is complicated by real-world variables, whether that's knowing the partner, how much you trust them to stick by you, what the actual penalties and rewards in the given scenario are, etc. Back when I studied finance, this came up a lot in the form of cost-benefit analysis in a competitive marketplace. For example, let's say Firm A and Firm B are both producing a product that generates a certain amount of pollution, and they each have two options for disposing of that waste. Either 1, dumping it in a local lake, or 2, having it sent away to be properly disposed of. In this scenario, rather than time in prison on the line, we're talking about competitiveness in terms of cost. To keep the numbers consistent with the prison example, we'll say that if Firm A dumps their pollution in the lake while Firm B pays for proper disposal, then Firm A pays $0 to dispose of its waste and Firm B pays $20,000. If both firms dump their pollution in the lake, then the lake becomes overpolluted and the government will fine both firms $5,000 each. If both firms agree to properly dispose of their waste, a combination of government subsidies and grants plus discounts for bulk service from the waste disposal company will bring the price down to $1,000 per firm. The most logical decision to make here is to dump the waste into the lake, because not only is the potential reward greater, a minimum cost of $0 versus $1,000, but the potential risk is smaller as well, a maximum cost of $5,000 versus $20,000. What's more, these two firms are in competition with one another since they produce the same product. That means that any additional costs incurred will be reflected in a higher price for their product than their competitor's product, meaning that they're less competitive in the long run. That $4,000 extra charge is a necessary cost of business to keep your opponent from getting ahead of you and to make sure that you can stay competitive with them. Sure, $5,000 for pollution fines will cause your product's price to go up, but it'll have the same effect on your competitor's product as well, so it's a wash in the end. However, this brings us to one of the complications of a real-world instance of the prisoner's dilemma: repeated plays, or what's called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. See, the assumptions of the basic prisoner's dilemma are largely based on a single instance, whereas in many real-world examples of such a dynamic, namely financial scenarios like the one I just described, it's an ongoing dilemma with an ongoing choice. In those instances, firms are in a position where they have to either eventually cooperate to some degree or die, and optimal strategies change dramatically. Let's say that Firm A and Firm B make their decision to dump their pollution in the lake in Q1 2020 and have to redecide their plan every quarter. The quarterly cost of dumping in the lake is effectively free if they're the only party that does so. The cost of proper disposal for only a single firm is $20,000 per quarter, whereas if both parties take advantage of the proper disposal, they'll only effectively pay $1,000 per quarter, as they can benefit from splitting the costs and subsidies and discounts, plus, we'll say they're both guaranteed certain contracts that are only available if no one's dumping in the lake. If both parties dump in the lake, they'll each be paying $5,000 each quarter in fines and cleanup costs. So again, in the scenario where this decision has to only be made a single time, the logical choice is for both firms to dump their waste in the lake and take the hit. Remember, they can't know for certain what the other party will do, but under capitalism, they can make some assumptions. Private companies prioritize profit making and have a fiduciary duty to shareholders to minimize risk and increase profit, so the correct decision is to take a $5,000 hit and move on. Sure, if they could guarantee that the other party would also choose proper disposal, then maybe they'd be fine. But since they can't, this is what they have to do. And depending on the shareholders in question, they might try and argue that even if they will be able to be certain that the other party will choose to work with them, betraying them still makes them more money. Or at least costs them less, so they might still go with that option. However, in this scenario, they also know that once Q2 rolls around, they'll have to make the decision again. And this is where things get complicated. In 1984, Robert Axelrod's book, The Evolution of Cooperation, came out, detailing an iterated prisoner's dilemma tournament where game theorists were asked to submit a strategy for how to win a tournament. Then the strategies were paired against each other, and after 200 rounds, they were ranked based on how they scored. It might surprise you to learn that the winner was actually a very simple strategy called tit for tat. You cooperate on the first round, and then you just mimic whatever your opponent did in the last one. It was actually a really important breakthrough for game theory for a lot of reasons, but one interesting fact about it is that it was never actually the winning strategy in any given matchup. It's incapable of winning. The best it can do is tie its opponent. However, it won the tournament because it always placed very similarly to its opponent in any matchup, and across all matchups, that left it with the best overall score, the best odds of getting the best possible outcome. In fact, while selfishness is the optimal decision in a single run of the dilemma, these experiments actually showed that the most successful strategies always began with cooperating with your opponent and then going from there. As a result of these experiments, Axelrod determined that in an iterated prisoner's dilemma, there are 4 key characteristics of a successful strategy. Be nice, be provocable, don't be too envious, and don't be too clever. Respectively, those meant that you should never be the first to betray your opponent, you should always respond to betrayal with betrayal and vice versa for cooperation, you should focus on your own outcomes rather than having a better outcome than your opponent, and you should try and demonstrate a clear train of thought that your opponent can also follow. Default to cooperation, retaliate only when betrayed, don't try to beat your opponent, and keep it simple, stupid. This is important when we're talking about financial prisoners' dilemmas in particular, because while this is the logical strategy, it's often at odds with the incentives of short-term profitability, and potentially even the survival of the firm in general. Even if it's logically the right way to behave, people aren't exclusively logical creatures. And what's more, what they think is their logic is still influenced by fear and paranoia, and sometimes that fear and paranoia can be rational. Does your opponent also know the logical approach? Can they be swayed to try and betray you at a moment of financial hardship to get ahead by a shareholder? The tit-for-tat strategy is the best one for guaranteeing that you'll get the best possible outcome regardless of your opponent's strategy, but it still requires you to shut down all those voices and stick to the plan, and for you to be able to trust that your opponents will do the same. However, it's not like you can't try to strategize with your opponents either. While the basic premise of the prisoner's dilemma is that the parties can't speak, most real-world examples of this dynamic would involve the potential to strategize in advance. And while you might think that this undermines the whole concept, it really doesn't. The important part of the prisoner's dilemma isn't that you're operating from behind a veil of pure secrecy and anonymity, but that the conditions are such that collaboration is the best choice for mutual benefit, but only if you're able to trust your partner to not betray you. And that doesn't require you to not speak to them. This is, again, the whole conceit of virtue's last reward. Even though the characters can negotiate with one another in advance of the Ambidex game, like right up until it starts, and even though they know they're playing multiple rounds, they have no way to guarantee that their partner can be trusted to follow through, and there are very real consequences for failing too many times in a row. In that version of the prisoner's dilemma, each player starts with 3 points, and they're told that once someone reaches 9 points, they can open the number 9 door and escape. I don't have time to explain to you what the number 9 door means. They're stuck in a saw trap with escape rooms, basically, and that's how you get out. They don't have to open the door immediately once they get 9 points, and once it's opened, any number of participants with 9 or more points can leave, but it can only be opened once. And once closed, anyone else will be trapped forever. As well, anyone who reaches 0 points will be killed. If both parties in each game vote to ally with one another, then they each get 2 points. If you vote to betray while your opponent votes to ally, then you get 3 points and they lose 2. And if both parties vote to betray, then nothing happens to anyone. I'm not just bringing it up because I like the game, but because it's actually a really useful way to conceptualize why the theory of tit for tat is so hard to actually execute in a real-world environment. Much like in VLR, an economic iterated prisoner's dilemma might not have a defined endpoint, but it can end. If a company goes broke, the game is over. If a company gets big enough that it can start just buying out its competition, then the game is also often effectively over. Thus, the incentives are complicated. For well-established firms or parties who already have enough points to ensure that the cost of failed collaboration isn't fatal, then tit for tat works fine. However, when the parties involved are in a precarious enough position that a failed collaboration will kill them, either immediately or inevitably, then betrayal becomes essential for guaranteeing survival, even if it long-term locks them into an unwinnable game. In a scenario like the one with Firm A and Firm B, let's say A votes to collaborate in Q1 of 2020 while Firm B votes to betray. The tit for tat strategy then is for A to vote to betray in Q2. If B votes to cooperate in Q2, then in Q3, A will also vote to cooperate. But if B voted to betray again in Q2, then A would vote to betray again in Q3. This is also part of why it's important, if you're doing the tit for tat strategy, to always start with cooperation, because otherwise you get stuck in an infinite loop of just betray, ally, betray, ally. Even if both firms are aware of the most effective strategy long term, it requires them to override a lot of the incentives of neoliberal capitalism. You can't be ruthlessly selfish. You have to be nice by default. You can't prioritize min-maxing in the short term. You have to make decisions based on reciprocation rather than pure profit seeking. You can't fixate on your relative market share compared to your opponent. You have to be able to focus on what's best for you in isolation. You can't try and pull a fast one on your opponent to get ahead. You have to maintain consistency, even if it opens you up to short-term penalties, because that's the only way to communicate your logic to your opponent and get them to understand the value of collaboration and the possibility of it. This is, in my opinion, what's going to happen with generative AI in a lot of industries. Right now, firms are operating between 2 options: incorporate AI or reject AI. Incorporating AI is good for attracting venture capital in the short term, and what's more, it allows you to lay off a lot of human beings who have things like labor costs. If your opponents stick with humans while you stick with AI, then congratulations, you now have a financial advantage over them since you're not paying for labor, and if the AI works, which, big if there, then you're still competing with them in terms of product and quality. If you stick with humans and your opponents go with AI, then you're at a massive financial disadvantage, will struggle to attract the same kind of investment, and will risk falling behind, potentially even permanently. What makes all this more complicated is that the nature of the situation means that the cycles of the game are fairly long right now. Restructuring your entire company to either incorporate AI or remove it isn't something that happens daily, weekly, monthly, or even really quarterly. The gameplay cycle is probably closer to at least half a year, if not a year here. And what's more, there are outside forces influencing things. Like I said, there are investors who will throw money at AI in the short term, which makes the reward for going with it even more attractive, especially for small startups. Unionization is down dramatically in recent decades, and labor protections are incredibly lax, meaning that laying off workers without owing them a bunch of money is also a lot easier now than it has been in the past, and there isn't really a collective bargaining voice that's capable of really fighting back against AI in a lot of industries. A company that goes with AI for one cycle will have a hard time shaking that reputation in future cycles, even if it goes back to a human workforce, and that makes betrayal even more risky long term, especially if your company's made a point of taking a stand on this in a previous cycle. The reason this is a prisoner's dilemma, in my opinion, rather than just a simple, straightforward cost-benefit scenario, is the consequences of non-collaboration, of taking the selfish option, especially in the long term. And that gets me to my next major point. Part 2. The workers. One of the fun things about the economy under modern neoliberal capitalism is that it is actively trying to kill itself at basically all times. The incentives that exist all push for a coalescence of capital at the top for the very wealthy, even though doing so means that the regular people will have less and less spending cash, and less money is actually cycling through the economy, which means that those wealthy people are going to eventually stop generating as much wealth because the people who spent money on them no longer have money to spend. This is a basic principle of supply and demand economics that you're probably familiar with. In general, demand goes up when people have more money to spend, so the less money everyone has, the less demand there is, which means less opportunities for the rich to get your money, because they already have it. This creates a stagnated upper class, an oligarchic system, kills any semblance of any sort of local economy or small businesses, and just generally means that you're screwed. However, for our purposes, we've got to get a bit more complicated. And for that, I'm going to define some quick economic terms for you, starting with income elasticity of demand. Income elasticity of demand, shortened to YED, refers to how much demand for a product is affected by consumer income, measured by dividing a change in demand by the corresponding change in income. For example, if your income increases by 10% and your demand for a Switch 2 increases by 20%, then you divide 20 by 10 and get 2, and 2 is the income elasticity of demand for a Switch 2. This is relevant because of how it connects to a few other concepts we're going to be discussing: normal goods, inferior goods, essential goods, luxury goods, perfect elasticity, and perfect inelasticity. Any good with a positive YED is considered a normal good because demand increases when income increases and vice versa. It acts normally. An inferior good, by contrast, will be any good with a negative YED. This happens when demand increases as income decreases and vice versa. Fruit Loops are a normal good, whereas store brand knockoffs of Fruit Loops are inferior goods, since someone with lower income will substitute the brand name for the store brand, increasing demand for the inferior good and decreasing demand for the normal good as their income goes down. Importantly, this isn't a moral judgment on the goods, at least it's not meant to be one, it's not supposed to be. These are neutral terms, we just need words to describe them, and in general, the inferior product gets more demand when there's less options, when you can't afford the better ones. So when you can't get a normal good, you'll get the inferior one. That's all it means. If you were raised on store brand Fruit Loops, this is not a dig at you. While inferior goods as a concept are pretty straightforward, normal goods get a bit more complicated. After all, some goods are essential goods. Goods where elasticity is between 0 and 1, which means that demand is affected at a lower rate than income in either direction. If income goes up by 20% and demand increases by 10%, or income goes down by 20% and demand only drops by 10%, then it's an essential good with a YED of 0.5. Luxury goods, on the other hand, are goods where the demand moves faster than income, where a 10% increase in income results in a 20% increase in demand, or vice versa, both of which give you a YED of 2. Again, it's important to not try and attach some sort of morality to this. A lot of goods that you would consider to be pretty essential in your life do qualify as luxury goods under this scale, because you will spend a lot more money on them if your income goes up a little bit because of some other unrelated factor. And same goes for essential goods, because even though some of them aren't literally essential to survival, they function like this in the economy. I just felt like I needed to make this clear up front because otherwise people start getting really upset about these terms. And to be fair, they're not necessarily the best terms that you could theoretically come up with, but they're the best we've got, so we've got to roll with it. There are also two other concepts to bear in mind here: perfect elasticity and perfect inelasticity. A product is perfectly elastic if the YED is exactly 1, since that means that any change in income will have an exactly equal change in demand. If demand goes up 10% when income goes up 10%, then it is a normal good with a perfectly elastic YED. Perfect inelasticity, by contrast, refers to a situation in which demand stays steady regardless of income, where someone making $1,000 a month versus $100,000 a month is still spending the exact same amount of money. You don't really tend to encounter goods like this in the real world because that's just not really how people spend money. Things can get very close to 0 or 1, but they'll almost always be at least a little bit off. Like, you don't change your spending habits based on a 1 cent change in price, even if you theoretically would eventually if enough cents changed, you know? I know I'm oversimplifying things a lot here, but the main reason it's important for our purposes is that the choice of this prisoner's dilemma comes down to either paying for a human workforce, the collaborative option, or replacing them with AI to the greatest extent possible, the betrayal option, where everyone involved's goal is to maximize profits. Profit is the result of revenue minus expenses, and in this calculation, replacing human workers with AI will dramatically cut expenses, which is why it has the greatest potential reward with the lowest potential risk in a competitive environment. However, if everyone in that competitive environment does the same thing and lays off all their workers, then none of those people are making any income anymore, and any company that makes and sells a normal good will see demand drop, which reduces revenues and thus profits, even though expenses are also down. To some extent, this can still be a winning proposition, provided that, the revenues still go down at a slower rate than expenses go down. And if everyone agrees to not use AI and keep a fully human workforce, it will be the option with the highest expenses, but also the one that keeps income as the highest, which means that revenues can also stay high. However, in a scenario in which some companies choose to cooperate and others choose to betray them, then the betrayers will come out on top, at least in the short term. They will have successfully reduced their own expenses, but their revenues will be minimally impacted since all those other companies are still employing workers who can spend their income on the AI company's products. What's more, the betrayers can afford to sell at a much lower price now, which makes the cooperators less competitive with them. In other words, the cost of everyone abandoning human labor in favor of AI, or all parties choosing to betray each other, is that unemployment skyrockets, wages plummet, and nobody can buy anything. And this is particularly important to keep in mind because nearly every single industry that's trying to capitalize off of AI, like tech and finance, really aren't producers of inferior goods. They rely on people having money in order for them to make money, and the AI doesn't buy iPhones or need a GIC. If all parties pick the betray option, if they all choose AI over humanity enough times, then they all pay the price in the long term, even if short term the balance sheets look better because expenses get cut hard. The kinds of businesses that stand to benefit from this are like dollar stores and huge chains selling inferior goods that operate at such a scale that they can drop prices to match. For any company selling a normal good, this shit hurts them. Producers of luxury goods will feel it first and feel it hardest, since demand drops faster than income does for them. But producers of anything with any amount of positive income elasticity of demand will get hurt. Remember, as demand goes down, prices have to go down to try and match. But eventually, the prices that consumers are willing to pay will fall below the cost to produce those goods, and the business will fail. Even if you replace all your human workers with AI, there's still the cost of raw materials, there's still the cost of transportation, stuff like that. And eventually, if no one has any money, they can't overcome that. And it's worth remembering that workers who are out of work not only can't buy stuff, but they need to rely on social safety nets. Unemployment insurance can't support an entire country that's been made unemployed by the robots, and low-income support programs for housing, utilities, health, food, and more are only functional in a system where the low-income population is a small portion of the general population. Social safety nets don't require everyone to be rich, but they rely on regular people making enough money to live comfortably and still pay their taxes and deductions into these programs. And when unemployment gets high, these programs have to either raise the burden on everyone else or go broke. That's especially true for private safety nets, since they can fail far more easily and are not obligated to keep providing an essential safety net if it's no longer profitable to them. Just look at what happened in Florida, where insurance companies are no longer providing homeowners insurance because all their homes keep falling into the fucking ocean or getting wiped away by hurricanes. Whether it's pensions, income support, health insurance, or whatever else, they only really work if there are a lot of people who can contribute to them and relatively few who need to use them at any given moment. Public systems have a major advantage here because they can move bigger mountains than the private sector can to keep themselves afloat. Private companies cannot mandate participation from the general public. They can't change legislation or regulation to meet their needs, at least not directly. They can indirectly do it through lobbying, but regardless, not as easily as the public sector can do it, and they can't force providers to either accept their terms or just straight up not be allowed to operate. Private companies have an obligation to transfer wealth up in the name of profitability, whereas the public sector has no such obligation, and often, in fact, has an obligation to transfer wealth downwards in order to provide the service and subsidize the poor at the expense of the rich. This, of course, requires you to have a government that's actually willing to do so and isn't just operating at the behest of the ultra-wealthy. As many of us know, that is easier said than done. It's also worth acknowledging debt in all of this. When someone gets laid off, they often borrow money and incur debts to fill whatever gaps exist in the current social safety net. They might use a credit card or a line of credit to pay for food if food stamps don't cover everything, for example. Or if food stamps stop covering anything because the government is evil. This is bad for the economy in the long term, because any debt you dig yourself into represents money that you not only owe interest on, but also money that has to be spent somewhere else on paying that loan before it can start going towards actual economic activity. To simplify what I mean, let's say that you have student loans that you have to pay $500 a month towards. That's $500 of your income that has to go towards loans instead of being spent at, say, a local business or on a product who might employ someone or employ several people to get that product or get that service to you. That's not to say that the loan was purely negative and just shouldn't exist at all. It allowed you to get trained and educated, which is important. But debt is a massive inhibitor on future economic activity, especially because the amount of money you borrow will always be less than what you owe because of interest. The longer you take to pay your debts, the more interest accumulates. And the more interest accumulates, the longer you'll be paying your debts instead of spending your income on actual economic activity. When you spend money at a business, like even something like McDonald's, that money will continue circling the local economy for a while, whereas money spent on interest just goes straight to the debt holder. The more of your budget you have to dedicate to paying off loans, and especially paying interest, the less you have to spend on the actual economy, the local economy, the things that matter. If you lay off a ton of people in a massive recession, they quickly accumulate a ton of debt, and it'll take them a long time to pay it all off and fully re-enter the economy. We need to bring it back to the prisoner's dilemma, so let's use the example of two video game developers to do just that. Developer A and Developer B are both faced with two choices: maintain a fully human workforce, collaborate, or replace as many humans with AI as possible, betray. They know that if they both maintain a human workforce, the collective benefit is the greatest. More money is circulating, more people can afford to buy games, and less people are relying on social safety nets. They'll have greater expenses, but they'll also be injecting more cash into the economy, which allows for actual competition to take place between products on their merits with a customer base that can afford to vote with their dollars. And they'll make it less socially viable for their opponent to betray them if there's sufficient anti-AI pressure from their customer base. If they both choose AI, they both save money short term, but they also kill a lot of specialized jobs, meaning that the people who get fired are going to be significantly less economically active for as long as it takes to retrain and get them into another industry, relying on social safety nets and accumulating debt in the meantime. This is especially important to remember because A, this is a luxury industry, but also B, specialized jobs tend to pay a lot more. And if you suddenly cut that off, you're not just cutting off a minimum wage worker, which is bad enough as it is, but if you remove someone who was making $100,000 or more a year from the economy and replace them with someone who needs to rely on the state for however much, that's a pretty big net negative. And if you do it a lot of times, it's a really big net negative. I mean, sure, they'll both face pushback for AI use in this scenario, but if there are no competitors that don't use AI, then there's nobody who comes out ahead of anyone else on that front. If the companies stick with AI, they're going to eventually face a higher tax burden to compensate for the reduced tax revenue and the increased burden on the system. But again, short term, they'll look good on the balance sheet. What's more, if only one party chooses AI, then the one that chose the human workforce is at a financial disadvantage. If developer A keeps their human workforce, they still have to pay for labor, and they'll also have to carry the increased tax burden from developer B laying off its staff who will no longer be able to contribute to those systems and will instead need to either be taken care of by a social safety net or will need to just take care of themselves by taking on debts, which, again, not good for the economy. I also should mention here, there's a big difference between an individual taking on debts and like a government taking on debts. The government taking on debts during a recession to try and fund public works programs or jobs is actually proven to be very good for the economy. Whereas if there's a recession and you have to take on a bunch of debt to try and keep your food on the table, that tends to be bad for the economy. People tend to conflate the two and be like, oh, well, why does the government get to take out all this money? Or it's bad for the government to take out money when there's already a recession. But it's more complicated than that. Don't listen to conservatives. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Anyways, under an efficient organization of the economy, these developers would get together long before the first cycle of this game even really takes place. They would agree to not use AI, and they would take an approach that prioritizes the long-term sustainability of their industry as much as possible. Unfortunately, we live under neoliberal capitalism, which is a very inefficient organization of the economy. So what actually happens is that both developers will be obligated to act in the interests of shareholders, and both the shareholders and executives are frequently less interested in long-term industry survivability than they are in making a lot of fucking money right now. And importantly, a lot of people, including and arguably especially a lot of rich people, are really, really fucking dumb. You can explain the prisoner's dilemma and the tit-for-tat strategy to them ad nauseum, but that doesn't mean they'll understand it. To an idiot, AI is the objectively right choice, and there are just too many idiots with power for logic to win out as much as it should. This is a big part of why so many firms are adopting AI, even as it creates this problem for them. This situation with AI also brings to mind the crisis or tragedy of the commons, an economic theory about the necessity of regulation for common resources to avoid depleting those resources. The idea of the tragedy of the commons is that without regulation, a common resource that is finite will be depleted and destroyed, rendering it unusable and unprofitable to anyone. The common example is a village that has a public plot of land that's great for raising cattle. To simplify it, we'll say that this village has 100 people who would like to use the plot of land for raising cattle, but the land itself can only sustain about 40 of them. If more than 40 people try to use it, the grass won't be able to grow back fast enough, and combined with the high traffic and increased pollution, the land will become barren and unusable forever. The tragedy is that, even if everyone is aware of this reality, they still don't want to be the one who's left out. If there's nothing stopping them, if there's no regulatory body that can get in the way of them, all 100 people will try and get in on the plot of land, and then it'll be depleted immediately, and then everyone's fucked. It's not the same thing to be clear, but the incentives and consequences are similar enough that it's worth discussing here. If only one person is exploiting the commons, or in this case, replacing their workers with AI, then the economy can survive, and that person can get ahead while their competition suffers for not having been able to take advantage of the opportunity. However, if everyone exploits it, then it'll deplete the common resource entirely, leaving everyone without it. The crisis of the commons is one commonly brought up when discussing regulation of everything from water rights to electricity to farmland, but in this case, I would argue it's actually kind of a reverse crisis of the commons. The system relies on every firm in the sector utilizing the common resource of labor as much as possible in order to make sure that people have money to spend, and while it can survive one firm not participating, it can't survive if nobody does. The problem is that not participating is the most advantageous selfish position, and so in an environment where the conditions align with the typical prisoner's dilemma, where there's insufficient regulation and where a lot of the people making the decisions are fucking morons, too many firms involved see no reason to deliberately disadvantage themselves. We have gone on a bit of a journey in this section, so let me just simplify what we've talked about here, just in the context of video games. AI only serves to displace workers for the purposes of creating profit. Displaced workers, particularly in countries without robust social safety nets, are poor people who incur debt to cover essential costs. Poor people have to make financial decisions based on their existing conditions, meaning that they need to cut luxury spending and rely on those social services. Video games, as non-essential products, are luxury products in economic terms. Displacing workers with AI means that people will broadly stop spending money on luxuries because there's no money left after the essentials. Hell, there might not even be enough money for the essentials. If AI replaces a ton of workers, the demand for video games will take a sharp dive as a result of a lack of spending power, and that means that studios will close up as their games aren't profitable to make anymore, even for the remaining human developers, which will only exacerbate things. This effect would be minimized, and the economy might be able to absorb it if it was only one studio or only one industry, but everyone wants the advantage of this, which means that nobody can have it. It is an iterated prisoner's dilemma, but on steroids, because everyone has to agree to not choose AI together even when individual firms benefit from choosing AI and rejecting the common labor market, effectively creating a reverse tragedy of the commons in some sense. In order for the economy to sustain itself for all of us, the general workforce has to have the ability to support themselves to the extent that they have leftover funds for both essential and luxury products, and also taxes. But if you choose AI, then I have an incentive to choose AI as well, because you can operate for cheaper than I can with human employees. Once everyone runs that calculation, everyone is incentivized to pick AI, even when the smartest strategic decision for long-term sustainability of the system is to collaborate and employ the tit-for-tat model. And once we do this sort of shit too many times, we end up having to try and make a profit in a world where nobody can spend money, where there is no possible source of revenue. But why should you care about any of that? Part 3. What it means for you. Put simply, any luxury industry that supports AI is cannibalizing itself in the long term, because AI cannot buy luxuries even if it can produce them. And while essential industries won't hurt as much as fast, they will still hurt. Walmart benefits tremendously from this sort of thing in the short term as a store built on inferior products. Same with dollar stores. However, you can't have an economy built on Walmart and Dollarama. As a specific industry example, video games are luxuries and cannot survive AI, but neither can most industries that we do actually enjoy. Everything from movie theaters to bowling alleys only function if enough people in their area have the disposable income to burn, and as jobs get replaced with AI, there's just less of that around. Chocolate bars, laser tag, professional sports, local restaurants. All that shit can only exist if we can afford to burn money on non-essentials. And AI taking jobs means that we can't afford to spend that money anymore, which means people can't make money off of it anymore, which means the products stop existing, which means that the people whose job was to make those products are now unemployed, and it just keeps spiraling from there if nothing's done to stop it. Even if your industry itself isn't at immediate risk of AI replacing human labor, the economic burden of all of this will be shared by everyone except for those who stand to profit from it. And even then, eventually, even those who profit will end up killing the commons and ruining the economy. However, this is not inevitable. What's far more likely is what I discussed earlier when it comes to the prisoner's dilemma. Namely, the part where firms in an iterative prisoner's dilemma scenario will eventually accept that collaboration on using human labor is more mutually beneficial than continuing to use AI, and steps will be taken to enforce this. Trade groups, lobbying organizations, and more will be formed to pressure legislators to create and enforce industry-friendly regulations that ensure that their competitors can't back out and screw them over. And those organizations will also work hard to create public pressure campaigns to make the consumer as anti-AI as possible to ensure that the financial repercussions of breaking the trust of other firms can't be profitable, because consumers would just reject them. This sounds fairly pie in the sky, I understand that, but it is not without precedent. In fact, it is kind of the precedent. Industries love being allowed to fuck around carte blanche right up until it becomes beneficial to get some friendly legislation to make sure that no one else can compete with them. In particular, it's common for companies, and even countries, to do this, to pull the ladder up behind themselves. Look at how many countries use coal to industrialize and exploit other countries, and then have pushed for countries like China and India to not be allowed to do the same. And it's not like it's not for a good reason, because climate change is a very real problem, but just because we might get to a positive outcome doesn't mean that it was done altruistically. I think we'll end up with a similar situation with AI once enough competitors are killed and it becomes clear that it's more beneficial to the survivors to start banning it, and I am fairly certain of that. What's more, there are firms who are trying to do what Axelrod established to be the best strategy long term. Namely, they're agreeing to cooperate in the first cycle of this, even when their opponents are communicating that they might betray them. As discussed in this article by Adweek, companies like Aerie and Dove are making a commitment to never use AI for their advertising, and that's keeping the door open for their opponents to vote to cooperate the next go round. I mean, we still kind of have to hope that they go against tit for tat in the sense that we hope that they keep cooperating, but who knows if that'll happen. Other companies who did vote to betray in the first round, like Lego, have apologized for their decision under public scrutiny and communicated that they will cooperate at the next go round. The problem is that that might not happen fast enough. See, the prisoner's dilemma only argues that rational participants will eventually collaborate, and even if we accept that these firms are fundamentally rational, which, big if, that doesn't mean they'll get there in time. Or that by the time they decide to act that way, they'll have the ability to do so. And that's for a few reasons. First, let's say that video games as an industry are functionally entirely taken over by AI. All art, all programming, all marketing, everything. If this practice got reversed after a year or two, it might be possible to hire people back. But what happens if they don't reverse the practice for a decade or two? After all, nobody's going to be going to school to study an entirely non-viable career for as long as it's non-viable. I mean, some people might, but not nearly enough to fill up an economy or an industry. If we make human software engineers obsolete tomorrow, and they stay obsolete for 10, 20 years, then when we go to try and unobsolete them, there will be none around to take back over. If these companies don't change course quickly, there's not going to be an option to go back in time and fix it. What's more, economies don't really recover fast. They break fast, but they recover very slowly. We are still today feeling the repercussions of COVID, of the 2008 financial crisis, and of any number of other economic wounds that never fully healed. There's that long-standing joke about how you can identify Reagan's presidency on basically any unlabeled chart comparing the performance of the US with other countries, because he fucked up basically everything in ways that have set the United States dramatically behind for decades, and which they might never recover from. If we displace entire industries worth of workers with AI for 5 years, help, even just a couple paycheck cycles, we would likely need decades to fully recover from the economic and financial damage. When people get laid off, their mortgages don't get paid, so their homes get foreclosed on. They don't pay taxes because they're not earning anything, and they rely on social safety nets that aren't built to handle everyone relying on them all at once. That's especially true if your entire skill set has been replaced in the economy, meaning that you can't go find work at another company or find another similar position in a different industry. And even if you can find work in this situation, your wages will have been driven down dramatically because of AI. This sort of thing not only wipes out your current income, but eliminates literally generational wealth. Assets like houses, retirement funds, investments, all that shit gets wiped out fast if this gets bad enough for long enough. You won't have anything to pass down to your kids, because even if they can find a way to function in the new economy, odds are that you can't pivot fast enough to avoid the worst of it. What's more, even in industries where not literally every single job is going to be killed, upward movement very much so will have been, because AI will be replacing a lot of the mid-tier positions that you'd usually move up into and through. This means that even if we get rid of AI down the road, there will be a massive vacuum of not just skilled labor, but experienced labor in a lot of essential positions. A lot of grunt work will likely still be done by humans, because then there's still humans who can be held accountable and fired if something goes wrong, whereas an AI leaves no room for corporate to pass the buck and make someone else the patsy when they fuck up and or do something illegal. There's no scenario in which we get to just hit an undo button and reverse those effects immediately. They're effects that will take several times longer to fix than they took to cause, and if left unchecked for too long, we will cross a point of no return. There will come a time where, even if all the parties to the prisoner's dilemma can agree that collaboration on a human workforce is mutually beneficial and essential, that option will have expired on the table. And that is what this video is about. The economic reality of generative AI is that it will obliterate any semblance of an economy in the not-so-distant future. If this shit goes unchecked and rips through the economy like the plague that it is, not only will it proliferate misinformation and destroy the environment, it will decimate the economy on the macro and micro level. In an ideal world, generative AI could be a positive game changer. If it could free us from the need to work while allowing us to enjoy the bounties of the planet and the AI, and if it could be trusted to get things right, big ifs there, then that would obviously be amazing. Like, I promise I'm not just a Luddite. I recognize how technology can be good for us, and in a world where AI does what the AI bros think it might eventually, hypothetically, theoretically be able to do if you give them $1 trillion a year, sure, great. But in the real world that we live in, capitalism doesn't allow that to happen. This is an economic model based on somebody needing to come out ahead. And frankly, it won't be me, it won't be you, and it won't be anyone else who encounters this video. It'll be like maybe half a dozen tech execs and the Walton family or some bullshit. So what's the solution? What can we do? Like, this is such a big issue. This is such a big economic force that it feels like we as individuals don't have a lot of power here. But the answer is that we have got to become absolutists on this shit. Reject AI at every turn. Punish companies that utilize it and try and sell you shit, and make it clear that the reason why you won't do business with them is that they use generative AI. Report the function as unhelpful when it tries to force itself onto your devices, and if given a chance to explain why, make it clear that you will stop using their products if this continues. And then, follow through. On sites like Google, where it is impossible to opt out of AI as it forces itself in front of you, make a point of scrolling past the AI summaries and answers to find an actual link to click on. If you stop scrolling at the summary, they treat that as if the AI has satisfied your needs, thus indicating that it is doing its job to them and to keep doing it. And also, just for your own sake, don't rely on those AI summaries, whether it's on Google or like in the YouTube comment section or wherever else where this fucking company is trying to put these stupid things. Like, they're bad, they lie, they get things wrong, and they're just not as good as actually going and experiencing what other people are doing and saying. When you see a local business using AI for marketing or branding or for whatever else, tell them that that is why you won't be shopping there and that you'll be encouraging everyone you know to follow suit. When you see content creators or artists or musicians or writers or filmmakers or actors or anyone else using AI, make it clear that you reject it out of pocket and that the AI is why. When you see your friends or family using ChatGPT to say some bullshit, don't be subtle about the fact that you think that makes them pretty clearly a moron for relying on this technology that's built for idiots. Like, shame is a powerful force here. Review bomb games and movies and books and albums that rely on AI and do not give anyone the blessing of ambiguity in your reasoning. Wherever you encounter generative AI, make sure that the people who use it know that they're being punished for it. The easiest way to accelerate the inevitable conclusion of the prisoner's dilemma is to raise the cost of betrayal. To get it to a point where it's no longer a prisoner's dilemma because selfish decision-making isn't more rewarding than collaboration with other parties. Frankly, be a fucking nuisance. Learn the lesson from conservatives here. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's why so many businesses are folding in the face of right-wing pressure campaigns to cut DEI programs, and school boards and libraries are banning books. Because they are fucking annoying and they make themselves inescapable. Be that. Do that. Make it impossible on the small, medium, or large scale for anyone to use AI without getting a headache from all the complaining about it. Vote with your dollars as best as you can. I know that is not a perfect system. I know that not everyone has as many dollars to vote with, but you can still do something there. Create pressure on legislators at all levels. Pressure your local, subnational, and national representatives in government to enact fines for using generative AI for false advertising or impersonation or whatever else you can think of. This is not the time for being picky about how exactly we push back against generative AI. We're about 18 to 24 months too late for the nuanced, careful approach. Right now is the time for you, me, and everyone else to treat any company using AI the way that conservatives treated Budweiser for doing a single ad with a trans woman. Public pressure campaigns do work. And what's more, we're frankly on the easy side here. AI sucks ass, and it makes everything worse for everyone. It's bad for jobs, it's bad for the economy, it's bad for workers, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for diplomacy, it's bad for education. It is bad for literally everything. It is not hard to make a compelling argument against AI, and we have an obligation to do so whenever the opportunity arises. That Adweek article I mentioned earlier also discussed how the companies that proudly voted to betray their human workers and customers like Coca-Cola, H&M, and Heinz faced significant consumer backlash, and credited that kind of backlash for forcing companies like Lego to change their vote the next go round. And thankfully, not only do we have consumer backlash on our side, but the technology fucking sucks at what it's supposed to do too, which makes the rewards for betrayal even weaker. This Morning Brew article from June highlights not only how consumers made AI toxic for companies like Duolingo, but also how AI's shortcomings have made companies like IBM, Klarna, and McDonald's reverse course and try to refocus on human labor, because turns out that the stupid computer program that prioritizes user satisfaction is really, really bad at saying no or communicating effectively with human beings in general. The article cites an OrgView survey that found that of the 40% of executives who had reduced human staffing in favor of AI, more than half were regretting that decision. 42% of companies that tried to get a generative AI pilot program off the ground have abandoned those projects in 2025. And that was only halfway through the year. It must also needs to be remarked that AI bros are some of the most insufferable, awful people on the planet, and that some of the most heavily publicized uses of it have been things like using it to create deepfake porn of everyone from celebrities to politicians to literal children. That shit sours a lot of people on the technology, and rightfully so. The other kinds of use cases that people see are it being stupid technology, like that video that went viral of the person putting an insane order in at Taco Bell and it completely bricking their tech. It's important to recognize that the only real argument that these people have for this technology is it's coming either way, so either get used to it or get fucked. And the reason that's their only argument is that the tech is basically pure poison when you have to argue on its actual merits. Our objective has to be to make sure that when it comes time for companies to choose either allying or betraying, not just with one another, but with society and humanity at large, betrayal is so poisonous that it is basically impossible to justify. And personally, I've stood by this principle in my own time as a creator as well, to the best of my abilities. The VTubing space is full of people who will use AI for artwork, for music, for writing, for voice acting, or even for their entire models, and I have cut people out before for knowingly using or excusing AI, and have made it clear that that is the reason why. My only point of caution here is that you need to make sure that when you see a campaign against someone for using AI, that it is actually AI. The more we push back against generative AI, the more opportunists are going to see it as an opportunity to settle old scores and trash their opponents. And so there will be plenty of bad faith accusations of AI as well. We all need to do our due diligence to make sure that we're not trashing innocent people who get caught in the crossfire, especially because many of those people are actually the victims here. A lot of them have had their work stolen for training the AI to such an extent that the AI is now replicating their style. Virtually any remotely popular artist that you've seen on social media has probably had this happen to them, had a model trained on their work. And that's only going to continue happening. Stan Twitter and basically every fandom on Earth has already learned the merits of an AI accusation in terms of taking someone down, and so it's worth viewing accusations with skepticism until it's proven. But for the people who are loud and proud about being AI artists in the heaviest possible air quotes, or corporations proudly touting how they've laid off human beings in favor of the computer program that's built to flatter you and lie while not doing its job, be uncompromising. Fuck them. They don't deserve your money. They didn't work for it. They didn't do anything for it. They are stealing from people with real talent and real value and real input, and they are actively imploding the entire economy for it. They'll figure that out on their own eventually, but without our pressure, it'll be far too late to turn the ship around by that point. We couldn't afford to sit around and wait for every dipshit to get on board with seatbelts, or not smoking indoors, or taking the lead out of gasoline. We can't afford to sit around and wait for the dumbest people alive to get off the AI train, especially when they stand to make a buck in the short term. And we're already making good progress here. More and more companies are walking back their efforts to embrace AI, whether that's in advertising or in products themselves, and it's in no small part due to how viciously people have gone after them for it. We're on the right track here. We just need to ramp it up more. Make it more toxic. Make it more shameful. Make that stupid fucking sparkle emoji that they all use for it a badge of shame. Make it so that every company, when they are forced to make a decision here, sees generative AI as the clear wrong decision to make. This is currently a prisoner's dilemma, a scenario in which acting selfishly carries the greatest short-term personal gain with the lowest risk, and collaboration has both a lower ceiling and lower floor. The goal is to make it so it isn't. To make it so that the short-term selfish choice of replacing human labor with generative AI is no longer the one with the least risk and greatest reward, but the one with the greatest risk and the least reward. We need to invert the incentives here, change the dilemma in order to actually save ourselves from a future that none of us stand to benefit from. Not even the people who are driving us off that cliff with reckless abandon. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. And if you really enjoyed it, you should consider becoming a channel member. My members contribute $5 a month or more on either YouTube or Patreon to support my content, and in return, they get to vote for one video topic per month. And this was the topic they chose in September. I'm finally almost caught up on members' choice topics from earlier in the year now too. All that's left is the Process of Elimination one from April, which I'm hoping to get out in November, plus the Buried Stars and Eye of the Somnium Files topics from this month that'll also hopefully be done soon. If you join today, you'll not only be contributing to the ongoing 2.0 debut Donathon, but you'll also get to vote on the November poll when it starts on November 1st. The topics for that poll are Oblivion, Skyrim, and how limitations can make games better. This video would argue that Oblivion's relatively more restrictive gameplay and mechanics actually allow the player to make more choices and explore more freedom than Skyrim's open-ended approach to skills, combat, and progression. What does it mean to perform poorly? This video would be about how we evaluate performance and how our understanding of performance metrics is counterintuitive, both in gaming spaces and beyond. The content creator crisis of the commons. This video would explore how online content is a uniquely modern crisis of the commons, and how that impacts the relationships between viewers, creators, and content. Psychosleuth and mental illness in killing games. This video would be about Psychosleuth, a killing game story revolving around the gimmick of transferable cognitive impairments, and would explore how both Psychosleuth and other killing game stories have handled mental illness in general. Like I said, if you're interested in voting for one of these topics, voting opens on November 1st for channel members. And if you want to vote for one of them, the links to join the membership are in the description. Lastly, thank you very much to all my channel members, both now and from when this topic was selected. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele, Robot Juice, and Bingo Banga. At the $10 premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Anja Tenar, Bailey Nichols, Cavi Corbin, Corey Anders, Theo, and NJD. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Destiny, Nemo the Survivor, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Gavoss, Catlover192, Crimson Cyclo, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Amon Dadley, Meep Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku _ Safon, Lala the Bambi, JMD Toaster, Ginkgo, Teo Tamara, Please Like Me, Puddinces, Alinea, Caffeine Jelly, Ismi, and Aiden S. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just click on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again sometime soon.